Yeah.
And I was just like, well, it's loaded down with 4 round nails. I was like, hold on. I was like, we had 13 panels and a gate. At the max, that maybe weighs 1,500 pounds. I was like, 4 round nails weighs around 4,000. And you want to talk to me about it rubbing on the thing. And we didn't have to turn it blue. And I was like, first off, why didn't you do a walk around in the trailer before you took off? And you would burst the tire. But he just doesn't believe.
Not a good situation. Okay, so we're going to start tonight with Seoul. We're going to do Seoul and the beginning of the British invasion, and then we'll save the rest of the British invasion for next week. So here we go.
Seoul. The role of African American musicians in rock and roll had changed drastically by the 1960s. Black musicians were largely relegated to roles where they took direction from major record labels, record producers, or television producers. As rock music included more and more white performers and listeners, many African American musicians and listeners began seeking out new modes of musical expression, which came to fruition in a new genre of music that would be called soul. Soul music came in many different variations, such as sweet soul, the Motown style, and southern soul.
Let's see if we can make this any louder. Oh, we sure can. Okay. All right. Many of the earliest rock and roll musicians were African American. We've known that for a while now. But in order to play rhythm and blues records on the radio, disc jockey Alan Freed retitled them rock and roll. With the success of artists such as Bill Haley, Elvis Presley, and Buddy Holly, all of whom were white, and more white artists began to perform rock and roll. And by the 1960s, the presence of African American musicians in rock had dwindled significantly. A few Black artists had some commercial success, but usually only when they had the full support of a record company or producer like Chubby Checker's The Twist. African American girl groups such as the Ronettes and Crystals also had success. And remember, they were often singing stuff that was written by white songwriters like Carole King. The place of Black musicians in rock had shifted by the 1960s, and many artists were headed toward a new genre of music called soul. In the late 50s and into the 1960s, a genre of popular music performed by African American musicians called sweet soul became popular with both Black and white artists. Sweet soul is a style of songs performed by African American musicians that had crossover appeal. Characteristic traits included a moderate tempo, that means it's medium fast, fluid vocal delivery supported by backup vocals in a doo-wop style, string accompaniment, and Latin beats in the drums. Unlike rhythm and blues music, sweet soul usually featured string instruments, and the drummer's rhythms often included Latin beats. The songwriting team of Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, who we talked about last time, wrote a number of sweet soul songs that the Drifters made into hits. Here's the Drifters right here, including Save the Last Dance for Me, On Broadway, and There Goes My Baby. When lead singer Ben E. King was fired from the Drifters, he began a solo career with the help of Lieber and Stoller and recorded hits such as Spanish Harlem and Stand By Me. So let's take a moment and let's hear a little bit. Let's hear one of the Drifters, and then we'll hear some Ben E. King. Let's do Save the Last Dance, because you can really hear the Latin rhythm in Save the Last Dance. Wait. Are you kidding me? Helps if you can spell mineral area. This was working earlier, I promise. Lovely. This is really going to be annoying. This is going to be a problem. Hang on. Time out. Talk amongst yourselves. Great. Well, let's sign up again. Why not? We have all the time in the world, right? Yeah, no kidding. Okay, let's do it differently. I do not either. Okay. Wow, I checked all this before we started. Okay, hang on. Okay, if you sent me one, where is it? Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Yeah. I've done all this. Wondering if it's a Mac problem, because it might be a Mac problem. They have not sent me anything. Okay, hang on. This is the beauty of having multiple email addresses. Okay, theoretically, we should be able to continue now. Let's find out. Come on. Thank you. All right. Now, let's see if we can hear. Say the last six.
You can dance every dance with the guy who gives you the eye, let him hold you tight. You can smile every smile for the man who held your hand beneath the pale moonlight. But don't forget who's taking you home, and in love you're gonna be. So darling, say the last dance for me. Oh, I know, that the music's fine, like sparkling wine, when you have your fun. Laugh and sing, around we roll hard, don't give your heart to anyone. But don't forget who's taking you, you're gonna be. So darling, say the last dance for me. Baby, don't you know I love you so? Can you feel it when we touch? I will never let you go. I love you oh so much. You can dance, go carry on till the night is gone. It's time to go. If he asks, if you're all alone, can you take me home? You must tell him no. Cause don't forget who's taking you're gonna be. So darling, save a last dance for me. Cause don't forget taking you home, you're gonna be. So darling, save the last dance for me. Mm, save the last dance for me. Mm, save the last dance for me.
So that ticks all the boxes, right? That ticks off the boxes of string accompaniment, moderate tempo, not too fast and not too slow, fluid vocal melody, backup vocals in a doo-wop style, and Latin beats in the percussion. So that checks every single box. So Benny King was the lead singer of the Drifters, and then he was fired and went out on his own and made a name for himself. And here's a familiar tune from Ben E. King.
When the night has come and the land is dark and the moon is the only light we'll see. No, I won't be afraid. Oh, I won't be afraid. Just as long as you stand by me. So darling, stand by me. Stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Stand by me. If the sky that we're the one should tumble and fall, or the mountain should crumble to the sea, I will cry, I won't cry, no, I won't shed a tear, just as long as you stand, stand by. Stand on, stand by me. Oh, stand by me. Oh, stand now. Stand by me. Stand by me.
String accompaniment.
Stand by. Stand by.
This light, sweet soul style was nowhere more apparent than in the music of Sam Cooke. Sam Cooke, right here he is. Between 1957 and 1965, Cooke wrote and recorded 29 singles that appeared in the top 40 pop charts. Note they said wrote. Okay, remember a lot of these folks were singing stuff written by someone else. Cooke did a lot of his own writing. Before he began recording pop songs, however, Cooke was well known as a gospel singer. In fact, his first pop records were released under a different name, so it would not negatively affect his reputation as a singer of gospel music. But the success of Ray Charles in the early 50s had indicated to record executives that gospel music could potentially supply a stream of singers for rhythm and blues style music. Cooke's style shows the clear influences of gospel music in his frequent use of melisma, which is the singing of multiple pitches on a single syllable of text when they stretch it out. Well, you'll hear it. We'll talk about it. As well as his improvisatory sounding style and frequent melodic embellishments. Some of his best known work is You Send Me, Twistin' the Night Away, which was inspired by Chubby Checker's The Twist, and Chain Gang. All these demonstrate Cooke's ability to balance pop, gospel, and rhythm and blues influences in his singing style. His song, A Change Is Gonna Come, is considered a theme from the civil rights movement because it plaintively and unashamedly addresses issues of racism and racial inequality. So let's hear two different Sam Cookes. Let's do You Send Me. Nope, I take it back. Let's do Twistin' the Night Away.
Let me tell you about a place somewhere from New York away, where the people are so gay, twisting the night away. Trouble on the run, man, you found the old and young, twisting the night away. Yeah, twisting, twisting. Everybody's feeling great. Twisting, twisting, yeah, twisting the night away. Hear the man evening close. How he got here, I don't know. Man, you wanna see him go, twisting the night away. He's dancing with the chicken sacks, moving up and back. Man, there ain't nothing like.
I may have room on this one, but I may not.
Twisting the night away.
I lean back.
blue jeans, dancing with the old queen. Stars and a diamond rings and twisting the night away. When you wanna see her go, twisting to the rock and roll. By the young and old, twisting the night away. Yeah, twisting, twisting man. Everybody's feeling great. Twisting, twisting, yeah, twisting the night away.
Going back. Watch you fit. And now back. Notice that they mentioned a couple of other popular dances of the time, the Watusi and the Fly. In that, he's kind of giving you instructions on what you should do. So that's kind of early Sam Cooke. Here's Sam Cooke a little bit later. This is the change is going to come.
In a little tent, oh, and just like the river running ever since. It's been a long, long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. It's been too hard to live to die. Beyond the sky. It's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. I go to the movie, and I go inside. Somebody keep telling me no. Hang on, it's been a long time coming, but I know change gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. Then I go to my brother, and I say, brother, help me please. But he winds up not giving me. Every time I could let go. Now I think I'm able to carry. It's been a long time coming, but I know change won't come. Oh, yes, it will.
That's a lot different than Twisting the Night Away. Some of the earliest soul music happened in Detroit in December of 1960 with the release of My Mama Told Me You Better Shop Around. Words and music by William Smokey Robinson and Berry Gordy Jr. Both of these names are super important in the history of rock and roll and in the history of soul. In the early months of 1961, it was in the top 10 charts, and it was a strong opening for a brand new musical group and a brand new record company called Motown. Motown being Motor City, Detroit, Motown Records. In 1959, the same year that Don Kirshner started Alden Music and established the Brill Building style, Berry Gordy Jr. borrowed $800 from his family and rented an 8-room house at 2645 West Grand Boulevard in Detroit. Gordy first called his new company Hitsville USA, and then he changed the name to Motown. Motown is a Detroit-based record company founded by Berry Gordy Jr., and it produced hits by African-American performers. It was named Motown in recognition of Detroit's fame as Motor City. Motown was one of the largest and most successful businesses owned and operated by African Americans. Gordy was a devotee of Booker T. Washington's philosophy of economic betterment, and he built Motown as an African American enterprise that focused on community and self-reliance. So let's hear Shop Around. I'm hoping this is something you've heard before.
When I became of age, my mother called me to the side. She said, son, you're growing up now. Pretty soon you'll take a bride. And then she said, just because you become a young man, there's still some things that you don't understand. Before you go as long as you can. My mama told me, you better shop around. My mama told me, better shop around. Make sure she's in love with me. My mama told me, you better shop around. Don't be so rude, I'm the very first one. And you truly love him, you take her gonna say how to now. Make sure she's in love with you. Make sure that you now. My mama told me, better shop around.
Through the period of racial unrest and riots in the 1960s, Motown artists sang of love and other human concerns which people of all races, religions, and political beliefs could identify. Gordy cultivated in his performers a sophisticated image, and many Black Americans saw Motown performers as role models. In his 7th year of business, which would have been 1967, Gordy sold more singles than any other record company in the world, independent or major, and his empire was profiled in Fortune magazine and the New York Times, and along with other major publications. It's estimated that an astronomical 75% of all Motown releases ended up somewhere in the top 40. That's amazing. a number to which other record companies could aspire but would never achieve. Gordy mixed the elements of previous African-American pop music styles to arrive at a product that would appeal to the market. Classic saxophone-driven big band riffs, we just heard some of that, gospel tambourines, hand-clapping backbeats, lush orchestra strings from the Detroit Symphony on the slow tunes, and solid bass lines laid down with jazz or Latin-tinged rhythm patterns. He avoided suggestive lyrics or gritty sounds for two reasons. One, he wanted to appeal to white teenage listeners, and two, he wanted to prevent white artists from covering his songs. And if the version by a Black artist was palatable to whites, then there would be no need for a cover version. Smart man. Gordy not only oversaw the music of Motown, but he cultivated specific looks and images for his performers. He was creating a total package. He wanted to create a carefully crafted image of middle-class African Americans to present to the rest of the country. Gordy hired modeling school director Maxine Powell, who taught the young performers how to make small talk at cocktail parties, how to hold their silverware at a banquet, how to move and act with style and grace, and how to dress. The performers called Powell's training the Charm School. Gordy wanted his performers to be prepared to enter the highest realms of society and to behave gracefully. Powell often told her students that she was training them to appear at Buckingham Palace and at the White House. Gordy also hired Cholie Atkins, a dancer and a choreographer in the legendary 1930s Cotton Club Revues, and Maurice King, the music director for big-name jazz acts at Detroit's famous Flame Show Bar. Atkins and King would not only let the musicians perform until they had learned their stage, lessons. Motown artists were classy, elegant, impeccably dressed, and perfectly mannered, all of which were carefully manipulated by Gordy and his team. This is Berry Gordy, in case you didn't catch that picture earlier. The Motown studio musicians were mostly jazz performers who enjoyed the new financial rewards of working for Motown Records. Benny Benjamin on drums, Earl Van Dyke or Joe Hunter on keyboards, Dave Hamilton on vibes, that's a keyboard instrument played with mallets, James Jamerson or Carol Kay on the bass. Carol Kay is female, by the way, and white, and Robert White on rhythm guitar. Secretaries and friends would fill in on tambourines and hand clapping. To get more backbeat, a studio carpenter had bolted a couple of 2x4s together with a hinge. Backbeat, Backbeat is a strong accent on beats 2 and 4 of a 4-beat meter, which are traditionally the unaccented beats of the bar. Friends don't let friends clap on 1 and 3. They always clap on 2 and 4. It could make a strong and crisp smack on counts 2 and 4 of the measure. This layered big band mix was captured at different times on 2 homemade 8-track tape recorders. Producers could bring in the rhythm section, horns and strings, background singers and lead vocalists all at different times while recording, and this approach made all the difference in the final product. A young electronics wizard named Michael McLean built these 8-track facilities, and Motown was one of the first record companies to use this approach to recording. Other companies were still using 2- and 4-track recording systems. Like Alden Publishing, Berry Gordy and Motown employed several songwriting teams who were responsible for writing most of the major Motown hits in the 1960s. Brothers Brian and Eddie Holland and Lamont Dozier, known as Holland Dozier to Holland or HDH, wrote and produced all of the Supremes hits from 1964 to 1968. I've mentioned the Supremes before, Diana Ross and the Supremes. They also wrote most of the material recorded by the Four Tops and the Isley Brothers between the years 1965 and 1968. They composed several tunes for the Miracles and for Martha and the Vandellas. Typically, Eddie Holland worked with the vocal leads in the various groups. Lamont Dozier helped with background vocals and instrumental tracks, and Brian Holland handled the overall composition and assisted with backup vocal tracks. Another important songwriting duo at Motown was that of Strong and Whitfield. Barrett Strong gave up a singing career to write songs for others. He and writer-producer Norman Whitfield had a string of hits for Gladys Knight and the Pips and the Temptations. They also penned Motown's biggest hit of the 1960s, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, which was recorded by Marvin Gaye. Let's take a moment and hear a little Marvin Gaye. Late great Marvin Gaye. HDH, Strong and Whitfield, and other Motown songwriters often took a portion of the song's chorus to use as an introduction, which can also be heard in the Supreme Stop in the Name of Love. We'll hear that in just a second. Another feature of Motown songs is a harmonic modulation that occurs about 2/3 of the way into the song. In most cases, the key of the song would move up a half step before the final chorus. A modulation is when a song changes keys in the midst of a song through a means of the circle of fifths. It's complicated. Just know that it changes keys and it goes a little bit higher usually. Like other songwriters, Motown songwriters also introduced a hook, which is a phrase we still use today. A hook was a catchy phrase or a melodic motive, a musical idea that's featured prominently in the song. Like in the Marvin Gaye song, we just heard that bass line, that opening bass line. Do, 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 do. That's a hook. You hear that, you instantly know that that is heard through the grapevine. Unlike other songwriters, Motown hooks usually did not appear until later in the song, whereas other popular tunes of the time had hooks from the very beginning of the song. So let's hear Stop in the Name of Love and hear the use of the song's chorus as an intro. This is Diana Ross and the Supremes. So you'll hear that come back again. Before you break my heart, before before you break my heart, name of love, before you break my heart. Diana Ross here in the center would eventually go solo. And the Supremes would never really recover from that loss. In addition to HDH and Strong and Whitfield, one of the best songwriters for Motown was Smokey Robinson. Previously mentioned with Smokey Robinson and the Miracles. We heard his tune earlier. Robinson was not only a gifted songwriter, but a performer in his own right. When Gordy first began his record label, the first group he put on the payroll was Smokey Robinson and the Matadors. They changed their name to the Miracles, and they plunged in to make the idea of Motown work. So obvious was Robinson's talent and business skill that Gordy named him vice president of Motown in 1961, well before the corporation had any major success at all. The Miracles eventually rose to the top of the industry with dozens of top 40 hits, including 5 songs in the top 10. Smokey Robinson did it all: gifted vocalist, songwriter, producer, advertiser, business executive, talent scout, premier backup singer, and emotional anchor of Motown. His compositions are outstanding representations of the Motown sound from the 1960s. My Guy, Nothing You Can Say Can Tear Me Away from My Guy, I Second That Emotion, and My Girl, to name a few. So I think most of us know My Guy from Sister Act. I think most of us know My Girl. Let's hear I Second That Emotion, because that's one you may not be familiar with. You wanna give me kisses sweet, only for one night of your feet. Now you'll go away and never call, and I feel so funny oh, that case I don't want to go far. I do believe that
loving me, you want to know. I said the word emotion. If you feel like giving me your emotion, I said the word emotion. That love would tie you down. You don't have the time to make love. Makes you wise to break the rules. If I don't want that would only break my heart. Oh, if you feel like loving me, you got to know. I said the word emotion. If you feel like giving me your love, I said the word emotion. I don't want to break my heart. Oh, if you feel like loving me, you got to show. Say the word. If you feel like giving me
Okay, well, I think we're gonna get there, so let's keep going. Motown Records took the idea of the girl group to new artistic heights with its cultivation of ensembles like the Marvelettes, the Velvetettes, Martha, and the Vandellas. The quintessential Motown girl group from the 1960s, however, was the Supremes. They began in the model of the Phil Spector girl groups in the 1960s and achieved phenomenal success during their recording career. Here are the Supremes. Here's Diana Ross out in front. Florence Ballard and Mary Wilson in the back. The trio consisted of Detroit teenagers Florence Ballard, Diana Ross, and Mary Wilson. And they loitered around Motown, offering to sing backup and trying to convince Berry Gordy to sign them to his label. Working almost exclusively with the HDH team, the group struck gold and released 6 hit singles in a row. Where Did Our Love Go? Baby Love, Come See About Me, Stop in the Name of Love, and Back in My Arms Again. Although Ballard was originally the lead singer of the group, HDH decided that Ross's voice was more evocative and began writing for her as the lead. In 1969, Ross left the group to start her own solo career. The song Baby Love represents the Supreme sound, the HDH style, and the Motown recording approach, all in under 3 minutes. The strong backbeats on beats 2 and 4 are produced with slapping hinged 2x4s. This song also features the vibraphone, an instrument that was often used in Motown songs. The song is in simple verse form, meaning it contains only verses and no choruses. Over 7 verses, Ross sings the lead and the other singers provide the backup vocals. A half-step modulation in the 5th verse adds a sense of excitement to the remaining verses. So let's hear Baby Love. Two, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4. There's that modulation, moves up. If the Supremes represented the girl group side of Motown, then the Temptations were Motown's top male group. Both Smokey Robinson and Norman Whitfield wrote and produced songs for the Temptations during the 1960s. They had a tight, smooth vocal style that came directly out of the doo-wop tradition. They were remarkable dancers who often performed immaculately choreographed dances such as the Temptation Walk. The Temptations' first big hit was The Way You Do the Things You Do, which was produced by Smokey Robinson in 1964. The Way You Do the Things You Do is a chorus verse song, like Baby Love, it includes a half-step modulation just before the third verse begins. The vocal lines in each verse frequently engage in call and response with each other. Robinson went on to produce My Girl and Get Ready for the group as well, but Gordy replaced him with Whitfield in 1966 with the hopes of replicating the commercial success of The Way You Do the Things You Do. So let's hear The Way You Do the Things You Do. This is something that you have probably heard in your lifetime at some point too. Motown was a remarkable label that produced dozens of stars during the 1960s. And it launched the careers of the Four Tops, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Martha and the Vandellas, and many others. Despite Motown's success, though, it was not the only record label that was producing soul music. Atlantic was formed in 1947 by Ahmet, I'm not even sure, Ertegun, Ertegun, I think, the son of a Turkish ambassador to the United States. That's interesting. Journalist and critic Jerry Wexler joined Atlantic in 1953 and was a critical force in the signing and recording of such artists as Ray Charles, Wilson Pickett, and Aretha Franklin. This is Otis Redding right here, who is also going to be a big name for Atlantic. Atlantic prided itself on a sound that was different from the sweet soul of Sam Cooke and from the Motown sounds produced by Berry Gordy in Detroit. Atlantic focused on a style called Southern soul.
Oh, sorry, but could you scroll back up for a second? I couldn't quite.
Southern soul, a style that developed in Atlantic records that drew significant influence from gospel music. It was typically more enthusiastic and expressive than its northern counterpart. Many white listeners believed that gospel music was an authentic expression of African American culture, and for better or worse, the crossover success of Atlantic recording artists took advantage of this white fascination with sounds of gospel-influenced Southern soul music. They worked closely with the smaller label Stax in order to find the artists who best captured this sound and style. Stax was a small Memphis-based label that formed a relationship with Atlantic in the 1960s. Frequently, a large record company would license recordings from smaller record labels. This allowed small labels to focus their energy on recording new and exciting musicians, while large labels handled the pressing of the records, the promotional, and all the promotional aspects, both of which were beyond the financial means of a small company. During the 1960s, Atlantic had right of first refusal on any music produced by Stax, an arrangement which was beneficial for both companies. Unlike Motown, Stax relied on a studio band. Booker T and the MGs provided the music for artists such as Otis Redding, Wilson Pickett, and Sam and Dave. Unlike Motown studio band, Booker T and the MGs did not play from prepared arrangements. Instead, they often came up with their backing tracks on the spot. The Stax sound included a horn introduction, and a delayed backbeat in which the entrances of the guitar and snare on beats 2 and 4 come so late on the beat that they almost feel like they're out of time. Like the music of Motown, most Stax songs are a simple verse form and don't use choruses. Booker T and the MGs also achieved some success as a band on their own, recording Green Onions in 1962, which went to #1 on the rhythm and blues charts. So let's take a little moment here. And let's hear Green Onions by Booker T and the MGs. So if you look at the picture over here, what do you notice? This band is integrated. basically a 12-bar blues form. The rhythm section's holding that down. So they can put the solos over the top of that. Another huge hit maker for Stax and Atlantic was the singer-songwriter Otis Redding, who we just pointed out right here. Redding recorded a number of crossover hits in the 1960s, including These Arms of Mine, Try a Little Tenderness, and Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay. Redding was at his best when he sang ballads, and his gospel-soaked vocal style brought a plaintive sound to many of his recordings. He would often interpolate words such as please and gotta between the phrases of his songs, which lent the recordings a pleading quality. Redding was killed in a plane crash in 1967, just after he performed at the Monterey Pop Festival, backed by Booker T and the MGs. Redding was the only African-American musician who performed at Monterey, except for Jimi Hendrix. Redding's singles brought significant exposure to the Stax sound and to Southern soul music more generally. Redding was also a songwriter. He was the first artist to record his famous song Respect, but he did not record the definitive version of that. That honor belongs to Aretha Franklin. Let's hear Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, and then we'll talk more about Aretha Franklin.
Sitting in the morning sun,
Let me highlight tonight.
I'll be sitting in the come, watching the ships roll in. Then I watch them roll away again. Sitting on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away. Sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time. I left my home in Georgia for the Frisco Bay. I had nothing to live for. Looked like nothing's gonna come my way. So I'm just gonna sit on the dock of the bay, watching the tide roll away. Sitting on the dock of the bay, wasting time. Look like nothing's gonna change. Everything still remains the same. I can't do what people tell me to do. It's all remains the same. Sitting here resting my bones, and this loneliness will leave me alone. It's 2,000 miles I roam just to make this stop my home. Now I'm just a sit at the dock of the bay, watching the sky roll away. on the top of you each time.
Aretha Franklin, the Queen of Soul, grew up in Detroit, daughter of the famous Reverend C.L. Franklin. Reverend Franklin's sermons were frequently broadcast on the radio and released on records. Aretha Franklin was exposed to some of the greatest gospel singers in the world, and she absorbed all of those influences and became a remarkable gospel and popular music singer herself. Her most famous song, Respect, was written by and originally recorded by Otis Redding. But Franklin's version is regarded as the defining recording of Respect. She transformed Redding's plaintive cry into an anthem of female empowerment. Franklin's explosive vocal delivery, impassioned articulation, and tone-color inflections all stem from her gospel roots. This gospel style is typical of the Southern soul style and the Atlantic Records approach to soul in the 1960s. Although Franklin's singing includes clear gospel influences, the backup singers in Respect are restrained and much more akin to the girl group tradition. If you haven't heard Aretha Franklin's Respect, it is definitely time that you did. So in conclusion, for soul, in the 1960s, soul music replaced rhythm and blues as the defining genre of African-American popular music. However, producers such as Motown's Berry Gordy created soul music that was intended to appeal to whites and to achieve crossover success. Motown followed the Brill building model, which we talked about last time, and released dozens of hits in the 1960s. And Gordy carefully controlled every element of his performer's presentation in order to craft a classy, cultivated image for Motown. Atlantic Records produced the Southern Soul style, which some white listeners considered more authentic because it drew heavily on gospel music. Under the leadership of Jerry Wexler, Atlantic made stars out of musicians such as Otis Redding and Aretha Franklin. And remember, Stax Records out of Memphis worked closely with Atlantic. Okay, so this quiz is open until Monday. What's that? Go away. Weird. Okay, so let's start the British invasion tonight, but we will not go all the way through all these chapters because there are several.
The British invasion, the Beatles. Until this point, we have focused almost entirely on American music. Beginning in this lesson, however, we will see the tremendous influence that British musicians began to exert on rock during the 1960s. The explosion of British music in general, and the Beatles in particular, is called the British invasion. After the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show in February of 1964, the British presence in rock and roll was firmly established.
Prior to the 1960s, Britain consumed much more rock and roll than it produced. The few British rock artists who achieved some success in the 50s and 60s were popular only at home and did not generate much interest from American audiences. British audiences' understanding of American rock and roll was also closely controlled by major record labels. There were only 4 labels, Decca, EMI, Philips, and Pi, and 2 radio stations, the BBC and Radio Luxembourg in the UK. There were no independent radio stations in the UK, and successful independent record labels were few and far between. The BBC was controlled by the government, and it had 3 channels, but only one of those channels ever played rock and roll. The BBC's program Saturday Club began to air in 1958, and it became a major source of both rock music and facts. The majority of rock and roll music that British audiences encountered at the time was performed by white artists such as Bill Haley, Buddy Holly, and the Everly Brothers. Several white American rock and roll groups toured Britain, which also increased interest in their music. Consumers could purchase rock and roll records by white artists, but it was very difficult to access rhythm and blues records by black artists. Films featuring Elvis Presley and Alan Freed were very popular as well. The popularity of American rock and roll music on the British charts inspired the music industry to search for its counterpart to compete with rock and roll. Early on, record companies in the UK had very little interest in producing records that would sell well in the United States because they first had to produce records that would sell well domestically and keep pace with imported American rock and roll. Rock and roll was not the first American genre of music to fascinate British audiences. Dixieland and big band jazz had sold well earlier in the 20th century. For example, in the 1950s, British musicians developed a genre of music called skiffle. Skiffle is a style of music that developed in Britain in the 1950s, and it blends elements of folk music, rock, and the British ballad tradition. Bands often consisted of guitar, banjo, and improvised instruments such as washboard and washtub basses. And by the way, if you're watching this recording, your code word for tonight is skiffle. Skiffle music would often incorporate elements of the British ballad tradition in which a lengthy tale could be told over the course of a song. Some British skiffle bands achieved modest commercial success at home. Pardon me, Lonnie Donegan's Rock Island Line was one of the first major skiffle hits in the UK, and it inspired a skiffle craze that lasted into the 1960s. But skiffle music just could not compete commercially with rock and roll. As the success and popularity of skiffle waned, a new style began to emerge. It was called Mercy Beat music, and the group that made it popular was the Beatles. But let's hear a little skiffle before we go any further. Here's Rock Island Line.
This here's a story about the Rock Island Line. Rock Island Line, she runs down into New Orleans. And just outside of New Orleans, there's a big toll gate. And all the trains that go through the toll gate, well, they got to pay the man some money. But of course, if you got certain things on board, you're okay. You don't have to pay a man nothing. And just now, we see a train, she's coming down the line. And when she comes to the toll gate, the driver, he shout down to the man. He say, I got pigs, I got horses, I got cows, I got sheep, I got all livestock, I got all livestock, I got all livestock. And the man say, well, you're all right, boy, just get on through, you don't have to pay me nothing. And the train go through. And when you go through the toll gate, the train got up a little bit of steam and a little bit of speed. And when the driver think he's safely on the other side, he shout back down the line to the man. He said, I fooled you, I fooled you. I got pig eyes, I got pig eyes, I got no pig eyes. I'll tell you where I'm going, boy. Down the Rock Island Line, she's the mighty good road. The Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Yes, the Rock Island Line is the mighty good road. If you go to ride, you got to ride it like to find to get the ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line. I may be right, I may be wrong. You know you're gonna miss me if we don't go. Down the Rock Island Line, she's the mighty good road. The Rock Island Line is the road to ride. Yes, the Rock Island Line is the mighty good road. If you go to ride, you got to ride it like to find to get the ticket at the station on the Rock Island Line. I'm safe for sin without trying to go sing again. Rock Island Night, she's the lucky little girl. Rock Island Night is the road to ride. Yeah, Rock Island Night is the mighty good road. If you go, you got to ride it like the night you get your ticket at the station on Rock Island Night. See the party, get some trouble and don't see me. Rock Island Night is the mighty good road. The Rock Island Night is the road to ride. Yeah, the Rock Island Night is the mighty good road. If you go, you got to ride it like the night you get your ticket at the station on Rock Island Night. Rock Island Night is the mighty good road. Rock Island Night is the road to ride. Yeah, the Rock Island Night is the mighty good road. If you go, you got to ride it like the night you get your ticket at the station on Rock Island Night.
No fade out. So stick that in the back of your memory for when we talk about folk rock in the United States, because that's very closely akin to things that were going on with in folk rock over here. The majority, let's see, we did that. Okay. What is that thing? Go away, go away, go away. Okay. The first iteration of the Beatles formed in 1957. John Lennon and Paul McCartney teamed up as a skiffle band called the Quarrymen, after John's Quarry Bank High School. The band went through several various lineups and name changes in the late 1950s, including the Rainbows, the Moonshiners, the Nurk Twins, whatever, and Johnny and the Moondogs. That's my favorite. As skiffle was losing fashion, another guitarist, Paul's friend George Harrison, joined the group. Members of the band were listening to a significant amount of American rock and roll, and they began playing in emulation of their favorite groups. The very first recording that the Beatles ever made, although they were recording as the Quarrymen at the time, was a 1957 cover of Buddy Holly and the Crickets' That'll Be the Day. The same record includes an original tune called In Spite of All Danger, which Harrison and McCartney wrote in close imitation of Holly's style. So we know that'll be the day. Let's hear In Spite of All Danger. This is the Quarrymen and an early version of the Beatles.
You at your door and fight a war.
Stu Sutcliffe bought a bass and joined up. Then the group added Pete Best on drums. The Silver Beatles, notice the spelling, now had 3 guitarists, a bass, and a drummer. And they had an insect band name in honor of Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Lennon, McCartney, and Harrison all played guitar and sang in this iteration of the band. Their first manager, Liverpool club owner Alan Williams, changed the E to an A in their name. And then in 1960, he got them a 2-month engagement at a club called the Indra in Hamburg, Germany. The Indra was located at the tough end of Hamburg's red light district, known as the Reeperbahn. The Beatles would return to Hamburg several times between 1960 and 1962. During their 3rd visit, they played at the Star Club and shared the bill with Little Richard for a while. At the same time, they were regulars at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, where they played nearly 300 shows in the early months of 1962. Both Liverpool and Hamburg were port cities, which meant that they not only did travelers through the seaport take the Beatles' music back home with them, but they also brought records of a variety of styles and many sources, all of which broadened the horizons of the young group. Stu Sutcliffe left the group to study art, so McCartney moved over to bass. In 1961, Brian Epstein was working at his father's record shop and had several requests for Beatles recordings. He couldn't locate a single recording by the Beatles. Since the Cavern Club was only a few blocks from his record store, he went to hear the band perform. And after a few informal meetings, he became the band's manager. He took them out of their leather jackets and put them in matching suits and ties, and he insisted on their matching Beatle haircuts. He also encouraged them to polish and solidify their playlists, which also lent their performances in an increased style of professionalism. Pete Best said he forced us to work out a proper program for the evening, playing our best numbers, not just the ones we felt like playing at the time. When Decca Records rejected his group, Epstein went to his friend George Martin, who is a recording engineer with the EMI label. He landed a new routine new act contract, 1 year and 4 songs, 1 cent per single, and 6 cents per album. In September of 1962, Epstein listened to the group, the first joint effort between Martin and the Beatles, liked what he heard, and hired Tony Barrow to arrange for marketing and distributing the release. Love Me Do and its B-side, P.S. I Love You, succeeded modestly in the UK, reaching number 17 on the British Pop Charts. Encouraged, Epstein and Martin set up another recording session for November of 1962. For the November session, Martin insisted that Pete Best needed to be fired and replaced with another drummer. Richard Starkey was hired away from Rory Storm and the Hurricanes and became the Beatles' new permanent drummer. The 6 magic components of an unparalleled musical team were now in place: John, Paul, George, Ringo, that's Richard Starkey, Brian Epstein, and George Martin. So let's hear Love Me Do. I love all things Beatles, but early Beatles, there's just something so sweet about the early Beatles music.
Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Oh, love me do. To love somebody new, someone to love, someone like you. Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Love me do. You know I love you. I'll always be true. So please, love me do. Oh, oh.
George Martin followed the single Love Me Do with the full-length album Please Please Me, which was released in March of 1963. Recorded at EMI's Abbey Road Studios, Please Please Me is a close representation of how the Beatles' live shows sounded at the time. Their entire album was recorded on a single day, and the final cuts included very few edits or overdubs. Of these recordings, George Martin has said it was a straightforward performance of their stage repertoire, a broadcast more or less. The album was a mix of Lennon and McCartney songs, such as I Saw Her Standing There, Do You Want to Know a Secret, and cover versions of American tunes, most notably the Isley Brothers' Twist and Shout. Twist and Shout was the last recording made that day, but it was captured in a single take. Their second studio album with the Beatles was also released in 1963. Like Please Please Me, With the Beatles shows the group's careful study of many different types of American popular music, including rock and roll, girl groups, Motown, and rhythm and blues. They include covers of several American songs and styles that have been discussed in earlier lessons, including Money, which was written by Berry Gordy of Motown, and Chains, which was written by Carole King and Jerry Goffin. With the Beatles also included a number of Lennon and McCartney originals, such as All My Lovin' and It Won't Be Long. Epstein arranged radio, television, and tour appearances to publicize the group and its record releases. Before long, the Beatles skyrocketed to the top of the British pop music charts. In October of 1963, the Beatles performed at the London Palladium, while 15 million television viewers watched and thousands of fans struggled to get in. As the hysteria for the Beatles and their music grew in Britain, Epstein traveled to New York in 1963 and began coordinating the group's first trip to the United States. For the Beatles' first trip to the United States, Epstein orchestrated an advanced publicity campaign that was meticulous in its careful planning, timing, and execution. Epstein had articles in Newsweek, Time, Life, and all the major newspapers. Capitol Records sent out 1 million copies of 7-inch Beatles interview record that gave radio listeners the impression that the Beatles had personally talked with every disc jockey in the country. All the East Coast disc jockeys were on a Beatles countdown. It's 9 o'clock, kids, 17 hours and 12 minutes until the Beatles touch American soil. January and February sales of I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You were at the top of the American charts. 60% of all the single records sold in America during the first 3 months of 1964 were Beatles recordings. Holy cow. When the Beatles finally arrived at Kennedy International Airport in New York on February 7th, 1964, 25,000 screaming teens were there to greet them. 50,000 fans competed for 728 tickets for the group's 2 appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show, and 70 million viewers tuned in at home to watch the performance. Nothing gets 70 million views today. Nothing. On February 9th of 1964, the Beatles performed 5 songs on the Ed Sullivan Show. They began with All My Lovin', followed by Till There Was You, a tune from Meredith Willson's musical The Music Man. Next was I Want to Hold Your Hand, which was currently at the top of the American charts. And they rounded out the performance with She Loves You and I Saw Her Standing There. With the exception of Till There Was You, all the other songs were Lennon and McCartney originals. It had only been 7 years since Elvis Presley had performed on the same stage, filmed only from the waist up to avoid creating a commotion. In those 7 years, the face of rock and roll had changed drastically, becoming an international sensation. During this first American trip, the Beatles only played 2 live concerts, one at the Coliseum in Washington, D.C., and the other at Carnegie Hall in New York. They returned to the United States later in 1964 for a month-long tour. In 1965, they made a late summer tour and went on a 17-day tour in 1966, which ended up being their last. Beatlemania swept the United States during each Beatles tour. In Kansas City, the pillowcases and bed sheets on which the Beatles had slept were cut into 160,000 one-inch squares and sold for $1 each. That's enterprising right there. Girls hid in air conditioning ducts to catch a glimpse of the band, and kids fell from balcony rails and elevated walkways. It was pandemonium. To avoid bodily injury from their adoring fans, the Beatles had to leave their concerts in an armored truck. The Wall Street Journal estimated that the sales of combs, sweaters, sunglasses, pillows, girls' underwear, earrings, and other Beatles paraphernalia amounted to $50 million, enough money to change the balance of trade between Great Britain and the United States for 1964. Wow. Following in the model of Alan Freed, Bill Haley and the Comets, and Elvis Presley, the Beatles also appeared in several movies. Their first full-length film was 1964's A Hard Day's Night, which was followed by Help in 1965. Both films and their music were tremendous commercial successes. The music of the Beatles, recorded and performed in the early 1960s, was modeled on that of popular American music, including rock, Motown. I'm sorry, something just caught my eye and it looked funny. Rock, Motown, rhythm and blues, girls groups, and rockabilly. The songs were often in verse-chorus form, simple verse form, or some other variations such as verse-bridge. Harrison played lead guitar, Lennon played rhythm guitar, and McCartney was the bassist, with Ringo Starr on the drums. These roles were not rigid, however. Lennon would sometimes play lead guitar, for example, and Yesterday features only McCartney. Songs that were not covers were usually written by Lennon and McCartney, although Starr and Harrison did occasionally contribute to the songwriting process. The lyrics were delivered by solo, in unison, or in harmony. Lennon and McCartney shared the lead vocals, but Harrison and Starr occasionally sang as well. They always wrote at least one song on every album for Ringo to sing. I Want to Hold Your Hand is typical of the music from this period. It includes a verse-bridge structure with no choruses, words and music by Lennon and McCartney, and a strong backbeat on beats 2 and 4. Called a backbeat in American rock music, this emphasis on 2 and 4 was called Mercy Beat in the UK. The lyrics were delivered both in unison and harmony. The first bridge of the song is sung in unison, and the second iteration of the bridge is sung in 2-part vocal harmony to add contrast. Because much of the Beatles' music from this period was recorded in just a few takes, the songs often sound like recordings of live performances which is for the most part what they were. Okay, let's hear I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Oh yeah, tell you something. I think you'll understand when I say that something. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. Oh please, take the wheel. Let me be your man. And please, take the wheel. You let me hold your hand. Oh, let me hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. And when I touch you, I feel happy inside. It's such a feeling that my love. I you got that something. I think you'll understand. When I say that something, I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. And when I touch you, I feel happy inside. It's such a feeling that my love. I get high, I get high, I get high. Yeah, you got that something. I think you understand. When I feel that something. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand.
And that's when they would unplug and leave the stage. The Beatles and George Martin usually finished their recordings in a couple of intense studio sessions. That process began to change in the mid-1960s as members of the Beatles became more and more interested in record production. They stopped touring in 1966, and their later music focuses on studio recording rather than live performance. Instead of following roughly the same formula for each song, a verse-chorus form with instrumental solos and catchy vocal hooks, the members of the Beatles began experimenting with studio effects, unusual forms and structures, new instruments, and unusual timbres. During that time, John Lennon said, "We don't write songs anymore, we write recordings." By the release of Rubber Soul in late 1965 and Revolver in 1966, the Beatles' style had changed drastically in form, production style, and instrumentation. These changes will be discussed in a later lesson on the context of psychedelic music. Personal, professional, and financial conflicts plagued the Beatles in the late 1960s. And in 1970, Paul McCartney filed suit to dissolve the Beatles' contractual partnership. Each of the four members released a solo album almost immediately after the dissolution, and each member's solo album featured at least one other ex-Beatle. McCartney had a particularly successful solo career after the breakup of the Beatles, and it was not until after John Lennon's murder in 1980, however, that the three remaining Beatles worked together again. They recorded a new version of All Those Years Ago in Lennon's honor. Today, the Beatles are still the best-selling band in history. Yeah, in case you don't know, John Lennon was shot in New York outside his apartment building by a man who claimed to be one of his biggest fans. It was a bad day. Okay, let's hear All Those Years Ago. This was released after Lennon's death. Several other rock artists who had been strongly influenced by or friends with John Lennon also wrote tribute songs, but this is one that comes from the Beatles themselves.
Shine all about love. They treated you like a dog. It's okay. All those years ago. I give. Like my shall esteem. But you praise. So it's night. Send out a prayer to you. Got all my God. This was so weird. Years ago. Years ago.
In case you're unaware of Beatle breakup history, a lot of people blame John Lennon for the breakup of the Beatles because of his relationship with Yoko Ono. And that's what Harrison is referring to when he says that you were the one they backed up to the wall. You were the one that they said was so weird. That he's referring to the fact that a lot of people thought that Lennon was the cause of the Beatles breakup. The truth is that there probably wasn't anybody to blame. Bands just come and bands go, even bands like the Beatles. Lennon was the first Beatle to pass, and then George Harrison passed from brain cancer. So we now have two Beatles left. We have McCartney here, and we have Ringo Starr, and they're both either 80 or knocking on 80. So, yeah. The Beatles began their career by emulating much of the American rock and roll, rhythm and blues music they admired. Many of their songs were either covers or strongly written in imitation of artists like Buddy Holly, Berry Gordy, Jerry Goffin, and Carole King. With time, Lennon and McCartney began to create their own sound that was inspired by American rock, but was an entirely new phenomenon, that of British rock. The Beatles exerted enormous influence on music and in culture. For example, when George Harrison played a Rickenbacker electric 12-string guitar in A Hard Day's Night, American and British groups alike clamored to get their own 12 strings and copy the instrument's jangling sound. By the late 1960s, the Beatles were the stars of the British invasion, and they led the charge for other British groups who would soon follow in their mold, such as the Rolling Stones, who we will talk about next time. Now, there's lots of music here that we did not hear. I encourage you to go back and listen to it if you don't know these songs. If you don't know them, you should, because they're touchstones of rock and roll history. And I would personally recommend, if you know Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you know Twist and Shout, because that's what the song he lip syncs to during the parade. If you have never heard Money That's What I Want, I strongly recommend that. It won't be long. I strongly recommend that. And Yesterday. If you don't know Yesterday, you should know Yesterday. So that is a wrap for this evening. That's as far as we're going to go. We'll pick it up with the Rolling Stones next time and move forward. So as always, if you have questions, please let me know. Quizzes 10 and 11 are open until next Monday. I'm giving you the entire week to get that done. So don't sleep on that. Be sure you get that done so that you don't fall behind. If there are no questions or any other things that need to be said or asked, then I will see you next time.
All right.
I hope things work out with your boss.
Six.